Welcome back, friends. This is Dennis Regling with Go Deeper Bible Studies. This is a bonus video for our class on Revelation. The literary structure of Revelation is just amazing. The book of Revelation has long captivated biblical scholars with its rich symbolic imagery and complex literary structure. Among the most compelling aspects of this apocalyptic work are the numerous chiastic patterns that permeate its narrative framework. These literary structures, far from being mere stylistic flourishes, provide crucial interpretive keys that support both a neuronic dating for the composition and a primary focus on the impending destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. For the contemporary audience of Asia Minor believers living under Nero's reign, 54 to 68 AD, these carefully crafted chiasms would have resonated with immediate relevance, pointing toward events they could reasonably expect to witness within their own generation. The recognition of chiastic structures in Revelation is not merely an academic exercise, but serves as a hermeneutical foundation that illuminates the text's original intent and audience. When we examine these patterns through the lens of first-century expectations and the specific historical context of Nero's persecution, a coherent picture emerges of an apocalypse written to encourage believers facing immediate tribulation while prophesying the divine judgment that would fall upon apostate Judaism within their lifetime. Chiasmus, derived from the Greek letter chi, represents a literary device wherein elements are presented in one order and then repeated in reverse sequence, creating an ABBA or more complex ABCBA pattern. This technique was particularly prevalent in ancient Near Eastern and Jewish literature, serving multiple functions beyond mere aesthetic appeal. In prophetic and apocalyptic contexts, chiastic structures often emphasize central themes, create mnemonic devices for oral transmission, and establish theological focal points. The sophisticated employment of chiasmus in Revelation suggests an author thoroughly versed in Jewish literary conventions and writing for an audience capable of recognizing these patterns. This supports the traditional attribution to John, whose Jewish background and familiarity with Old Testament structural techniques would have equipped him to construct such elaborate literary frameworks. More importantly, the specific content and emphasis of these chiasms point consistently toward concerns that would have been paramount during the Neronic period: persecution by Rome, the fate of Jerusalem, and the vindication of Christian witness. The temporal urgency embedded within these structures cannot be overstated. The recurring emphasis on imminence, the time is near, 1:3, what must soon take place, 1:1, is not merely scattered throughout the text, but is architecturally integrated into the chiastic frameworks themselves. This suggests that the author intended these patterns to reinforce the message of immediate relevance rather than distant eschatological speculation. Before examining specific chiasms within Revelation, it is essential to recognize that the entire book exhibits a macro-chiastic structure that frames its central message. This overarching pattern can be outlined as follows. A. Prologue, Blessing in the Seven Churches, 1:1 to 3:22. B. Heavenly Throne Room and the Sealed Scroll, 4:1 to 5:14. Key, Seven Seals, Judgment Begins, 6:1 to 8:1. D. Seven Trumpets, Intensified Judgment, 8, Duci Ilsebilben. The Central Vision, the Woman, Dragon, and Beasts, 12:1 to 14:20. D. Seven Bowls, Completed Judgment, 15:1 to 16:21. K. Fall of Babylon and Final Battles, 17:1 to 20:15. B. New Heaven, New Earth, and New Jerusalem, 21:1 to 22.5. A. Epilogue, Warning and the Seven Spirits, 22:6-21. The central panel, E, focuses on the cosmic conflict between the people of God and the forces of evil, represented by the dragon, Satan, and the two beasts, Roman imperial power and apostate Judaism. This positioning is not accidental. It places the contemporary crisis of Neronic persecution and the impending judgment of Jerusalem at the literary and theological center of the entire work. This macro structure supports a Neronic dating in several ways. First, the emphasis on imperial persecution, the beast from the sea, and religious apostasy, the beast from the land, representing the Jerusalem establishment, reflects the specific challenges facing Christians during the 60s AD. Second, the promise of Babylon's fall, 17 to 18, would have carried immediate relevance to an audience witnessing the growing tensions that would culminate in the Jewish war. Third, the assurance of vindication and new creation, 21 to 22, provides hope for believers enduring present suffering while anticipating imminent divine intervention. The vision of the heavenly throne room in chapters 4 to 5 exhibits a carefully constructed chiastic pattern that establishes the theological foundation for all subsequent judgments. The one on the throne, 4:2-3. B, 24 elders and 4 living creatures, 4 to 8. Khan, worship of the Creator, 4:9 to 11. Morda, the sealed scroll and the search for one worthy, 5:1 to 4. The lion lamb declared worthy, 5 to 6. Da, the lamb takes the scroll, 5:7 to 8. Respa, worship of the Redeemer, 5:9 to 12. B, universal worship, 5:13. Os, the one on the throne and the lamb, 5:14. The central focus on the lion lamb, 5 to 6, establishes Christ's unique qualification to execute judgment through his sacrificial death and messianic authority. This dual imagery, combining the conquering Lion of Judah with the slain lamb, directly addresses the concerns of Neronic-era Christians who needed assurance that their apparently defeated Messiah possessed ultimate authority over earthly powers, including Caesar himself. The reference to the Lion of Judah carries particular significance for a first-century Jewish Christian audience, anticipating judgment upon Jerusalem. This messianic title, rooted in Genesis 49, 9 through 10, would have evoked expectations of divine intervention in Israel's affairs. The fact that this lion appears as a lamb standing as though slain, 5:6, indicates that messianic victory comes through apparent defeat, a message especially relevant to Christians suffering under Roman persecution while awaiting vindication. Furthermore, the scroll sealed with 7 seals represents the divine plan for judgment, which the Lamb alone can unveil and execute. In the context of Neronic dating, this scroll contains the specific judgments that would befall the covenant-breaking nation within the current generation, as Jesus had prophesied in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. The 7 seals form a sophisticated chiastic structure that builds toward the climactic judgment of the covenant people. Of the first 4 seals, the 4 horsemen, 6:1 to 8. B, 5th seal, martyrs under the altar, 6:9 to 11. Ambai, 6th seal, cosmic upheaval and terror, 6:12 to 17. D, interlude, sealing of the 144,000 and great multitude, 7:1 to 17. Chi, 7th seal, silence in heaven, 8:1. The central interlude, 7:1 to 17, serves as the theological heart of this section, emphasizing God's protection of his people during the coming tribulation. The 144,000 sealed from the tribes of Israel represents the faithful remnant within Judaism who have accepted the Messiah, while the great multitude from every nation represents the Gentile church. This dual emphasis reflects the transitional moment of redemptive history that the original audience was experiencing, the final days of the Old Covenant order and the full establishment of the New Covenant community. The imagery of sealing God's servants before the judgments fall, 7:3, directly parallels Ezekiel 9:4 through 6, where righteous individuals in Jerusalem are marked for protection before divine judgment destroys the city. This connection would have been unmistakable to Jewish Christians familiar with the prophetic tradition, reinforcing the expectation that Jerusalem's destruction was imminent while assuring them of divine protection. The martyrs under the altar, 6:9 to 11, crying out, "How long?" receive the response that they must wait until the number of their fellow servants and brothers should be complete. In the context of Neronic persecution, this suggests that the full measure of martyrdom was nearly reached, after which divine vengeance would fall upon their persecutors. The white robes given to these martyrs symbolize their vindication, which would be manifested in the approaching judgment of both Rome and Jerusalem. The trumpet judgments exhibit a clear chiastic pattern that intensifies the message of impending doom while highlighting the redemptive purpose behind divine judgment. A. First 4 trumpets, environmental devastation, 8:6 to 12. B. Fifth trumpet, demonic torment, 9:3, 1 to 12. C. Sixth trumpet, massive army and partial repentance, 9:13 to 21. Datsu. Interlude, the little scroll and 2 witnesses, 10 to 1 to 11:14. 2. Seventh trumpet, kingdom proclamation, 11:15 to 19. The central interlude containing the little scroll and the 2 witnesses, 10:1 to 11:14, forms the theological climax of this section. The little scroll, which is sweet in the mouth but bitter in the stomach, 10:9 to 10, represents the prophetic message that brings joy to the faithful but announces bitter judgment upon the rebellious. This perfectly captures the dual nature of the gospel in the first century: salvation for believers and condemnation for those who reject the Messiah. The 2 witnesses, 11:3 to 12, prophesy for 1,260 days, 3.5 years, before being killed by the beast that rises from the bottomless pit, 11:7. Their resurrection and ascension after 3.5 days, 11:11 to 12, followed by a great earthquake that destroys 1/10 of the city, 11:13, clearly points to events in Jerusalem. The time frame of 1,260 days corresponds to the period of intensified conflict leading up to the city's destruction, while the earthquake and partial destruction prefigure the complete devastation that would follow. Significantly, the 2 witnesses prophesy in the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified, 11:8. This unmistakably identifies the location as Jerusalem, now characterized as spiritually equivalent to the archetypal cities of immorality, Sodom, and bondage, Egypt. This harsh characterization reflects the prophetic tradition of condemning apostate Israel and would have resonated powerfully with Christians who had been expelled from synagogues and persecuted by Jewish authorities. The central section of Revelation, chapters 12 to 14, contains the most complex and significant chiastic structure in the entire book. A. The woman and the dragon, 12:1 to 6. What? War in heaven, Satan cast down, 12:7 to 12. Dragon's persecution of the woman, 12:13 to 17. D. Beast from the sea, 13:1 to 10. E. Beast from the land, 13:11 to 18. Fight of the Lamb and the 144,000 on Mount Zion, 14:1 to 5. Doki, 3 angels' messages, 14:6 to 13. Dane harvest of the earth, 14:14 to 20. Kab, Adaka, the central focus on the Lamb and the 144,000 on Mount Zion, 14:1 to 5, provides the key to understanding this entire section. These are the faithful who have not defiled themselves with women, spiritual adultery, with false religion, and follow the Lamb wherever he goes. In the context of first century Judaism and early Christianity, this represents those who have remained faithful to the true covenant, while apostate Judaism has entered into spiritual adultery with Rome. The beast from the sea, 13:1 to 10, clearly represents Roman imperial power, with its 7 heads corresponding to 7 emperors and its demand for worship reflecting the imperial cult. The description of one head appearing to have a mortal wound that was healed, 13:3, most naturally refers to the Nero redivivus myth, the belief that Nero, despite his apparent death in 68 AD, would return to lead the eastern provinces in rebellion against Rome. This detail strongly supports composition during or shortly after Nero's reign. The beast from the land, 13:11 to 18, also called the false prophet, exercises the authority of the first beast and deceives the inhabitants of the earth. This beast has 2 horns like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon, 13:11, suggesting a deceptive appearance of religious legitimacy. In the historical context of the 60s AD, this most naturally represents the Jewish religious establishment, which appeared to maintain covenant relationship with God, but had actually allied itself with Rome against the true people of God. The number of the beast, 666, 1318, has generated enormous speculation, but in the context of neuronic dating, the most straightforward interpretation remains the gematria for Nero Caesar in Hebrew characters NRVN KSR, which equals 666. This identification was already suggested by some ancient commentators and fits perfectly with the historical context of Christian persecution under Nero. The final series of judgments, the 7 bowls of wrath, exhibit a chiastic structure that brings divine judgment to its climactic completion. A. Introduction. Song of Moses and the Lamb, 15:1-4. Baxi, 7 angels with 7 bowls, 15:5-8. Hey, first 4 bowls, earth, sea, rivers, sun, 16:1-9. Do, 5th bowl, darkness on the beast's throne, 16:10-11. E, 6th bowl, preparation for Armageddon, 16:12-16. D, 7th bowl, it is done, 16:17-21. Ein Chain, great earthquake and hail, Bay, E. The central focus on the preparation for Armageddon, 16:12-16, represents the gathering of earthly powers for their final confrontation with divine authority. The reference to the kings from the east, 16:12, and the drying up of the Euphrates would have carried immediate significance for first-century readers familiar with Parthian threats to Roman stability and the complex political dynamics of the eastern provinces. Armageddon, Har Megiddo, evokes the plain of Megiddo, site of numerous decisive battles in Israel's history. However, in the symbolic universe of Revelation, this represents not a literal geographic location, but the ultimate confrontation between the kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of God. For Neuronic-era Christians, this would have pointed to the imminent crisis that would determine the fate of both Roman power and Jewish opposition to the gospel. The account of Babylon's judgment forms a sophisticated chiastic structure that emphasizes both the certainty and the justice of divine judgment. A. The great prostitute's description, 17:1-6. B. The beast and its head's horns, explained, 17:3, 7-14. C. The prostitute's destruction by the beast, 17:15-18. D. Babylon's fall announced, 18:1-3. K. Call to come out and avoid her plagues, 18:4-8. 3 groups lament her fall, 18-19. A. Heaven rejoices at her judgment, 18:20-24. The central announcement of Babylon's fall, 18:1-3, serves as the theological focal point of this section. The mighty angel's proclamation that Babylon the Great has fallen, 18:2, uses prophetic perfect tense, indicating the certainty of future judgment. For first-century readers, this would have pointed primarily to Jerusalem, which had become spiritually equivalent to Babylon through its rejection of the Messiah and alliance with Rome. The identification of Babylon with Jerusalem rather than Rome finds support in several key details. The reference to the blood of prophets and saints and all who have been slain on earth, 18:24, echoes Jesus' condemnation of Jerusalem in Matthew 23:35-37, where he specifically attributes the guilt for all righteous blood to that generation in Jerusalem. Additionally, the description of Babylon as a great city, 18:16, 18:19, that rules over the kings of the earth, better fits Jerusalem's role as the center of covenant relationship with God than Rome's political dominance. The call to "come out of her, my people," 18:4, would have had immediate practical relevance for Jewish Christians in Palestine who needed to flee Jerusalem before its destruction, just as Jesus had warned in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24:16-18. The historical record indicates that the Christian community in Jerusalem did indeed flee to Pella before the Roman siege, demonstrating their understanding of prophetic warnings about the city's fate. The concluding section of Revelation exhibits a grand chiastic structure that brings the entire narrative to its triumphant conclusion. Marriage Supper of the Lamb, 19.1-10. Rider on white horse and battle, 19:11-21. Tyche, Millennium and Final Judgment, 20:1-15. New Heaven and New Earth, 21:1-8. Kuquai, New Jerusalem described, 21, 9, 22:5. Bain, final warnings and promises, 22, 6-17. A final invitation and blessing, 22, 18-21. The central vision of the new heaven and new earth, 21, 1-8, represents the ultimate goal of divine judgment, not mere destruction, but new creation. The declaration that the former things have passed away, 21:4, and behold, I am making all things new, 21:5, indicates a fundamental transformation of the covenant order rather than the end of the physical universe. In the context of first century expectations, this new creation language would have been understood primarily in covenantal terms. The passing away of the first heaven and earth represents the dissolution of the old covenant system centered in Jerusalem, while the new heaven and earth represent the fully established new covenant order. This interpretation aligns with other New Testament uses of creation language to describe covenantal transformation, 2 Corinthians 5:17, Galatians 6:15. The New Jerusalem that descends from heaven, 21:2, 9-22:5, stands in stark contrast to the earthly Jerusalem that had become Babylon. This heavenly city represents the true covenant community composed of both Jewish and Gentile believers, which would emerge triumphant from the tribulation of the late 60s AD. The absence of a temple in this city, 21:22, indicates that the old sacrificial system has been permanently superseded by direct access to God through Christ. Theological implications of the chiastic structure. The pervasive use of chiastic patterns throughout Revelation serves multiple theological purposes that support both Neuronic dating and a primary focus on Jerusalem's judgment. First, these structures emphasize the divine sovereignty behind historical events that might otherwise appear chaotic or meaningless. The carefully ordered literary architecture mirrors the divine order that governs historical unfolding, assuring readers that current sufferings serve a larger redemptive purpose. Second, the chiasms create a sense of inevitability and completion that would have encouraged believers facing immediate persecution. The literary movement from problem to resolution, from conflict to victory, from judgment to new creation provides a framework for understanding their present experiences within the context of divine purpose. This would have been particularly important for Christians tempted to compromise their faith under Neuronic persecution. Third, the concentric nature of chiastic structure naturally emphasizes central elements, and in Revelation, these central points consistently highlight themes relevant to first century believers: Christ's authority over earthly powers, the protection of God's people during tribulation, the certainty of divine judgment upon covenant breakers, and the ultimate triumph of the kingdom of God. The chiastic structures in Revelation find remarkable correspondence with known historical developments of the first century. The progression from imperial persecution, the beast from the sea, through religious apostasy, the beast from the land, to the final judgment of the covenant-breaking city, Babylon's fall, accurately mirrors the historical sequence from Neuronic persecution through the Jewish war to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. The literary emphasis on imminence throughout these chiastic patterns aligns perfectly with the documented urgency felt by first-century Christians. The repeated assurances that events would occur soon and that the time is near would have provided crucial encouragement to believers who indeed witnessed the fulfillment of these prophecies within their own generation. For contemporary readers, recognizing these chiastic structures provides interpretive clarity that prevents the misapplication of first-century prophecies to modern situations. While the book certainly contains principles and patterns that remain relevant, the specific judgments described in these carefully crafted literary frameworks found their primary fulfillment in the events of 70 AD. The chiastic structures permeating the book of Revelation provide compelling evidence for both Neuronic dating and a primary interpretive focus on the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. These sophisticated literary patterns demonstrate that the author was writing for an immediate audience facing contemporary crises, not distant future generations. The architectural precision of these chiasms reveals careful composition during a period when the described events were genuinely imminent rather than speculative. The theological message embedded within these structures emphasizes divine sovereignty over apparently chaotic historical events, assurance of protection for the faithful during tribulation, and certainty of judgment upon covenant breakers. For believers living under Nero's persecution and anticipating the crisis that would engulf Palestine within their generation, these chiastic patterns provided both interpretive framework and practical encouragement. Understanding Revelation through the lens of its chiastic structure thus recovers the immediate relevance and practical purpose that the book held for its original audience, while providing contemporary readers with valuable insights into the nature of divine judgment and redemption. Rather than an esoteric code for distant future events, Revelation emerges as a pastoral letter of encouragement for believers facing immediate persecution, structured through sophisticated literary techniques that emphasize the certainty of divine faithfulness and the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. The recognition of these patterns should encourage contemporary biblical scholarship to approach apocalyptic literature with greater attention to original historical context and literary structure. Only by understanding how these texts functioned within their immediate historical setting can we properly appreciate their continuing theological significance and avoid the interpretive pitfalls that have too often characterized the study of prophetic literature. In the end, the chiastic structures of Revelation testify to both the literary sophistication of its author and the pastoral heart that motivated its composition. John wrote not as a cryptic oracle for distant generations, but as a shepherd caring for his contemporary flock, using the finest literary techniques available to communicate divine truth with maximum clarity and impact. The enduring power of his message lies not in its supposed prediction of modern events, but in its demonstration of how divine faithfulness operates within the specific circumstances of historical crisis, providing a paradigm for understanding God's continuing work in every generation. Thank you for watching.